Hello, thank you again for finding this link and being diligent with this assignment. Over the next couple of brief screen capture narrations, I'm going to take you through a few of these slides, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to move relatively swiftly, and I'm just going to assume that you can kind of go back and take a look at these and integrate this with the reading. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some things that maybe aren't in the reading, or you can't easily Google, or things like that, and just to put it together as a package. So in any case, one of the things we're going to take a look at, as you can see here, are a variety of different things. We're going to look at search and seizure issues, so this will go directly to Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment issues for any of you who are criminal justice majors who are interested in being police officers. But also this applies to any citizen who might be stopped, or to know what your rights are and what the Constitution says and what the Supreme Court has said that the Constitution says. We're going to look at technology, new technologies, and how that's kind of changing or not changing how we look at privacy. The so-called takings clause and how sort of property plays into this, and issues of confidentiality, sexuality, and even the body. So a lot in a short period of time. So bear with me. We'll move ahead now. So it might be helpful to consider the background, as this is a history course. Sometimes this is a handy way of kind of approaching the material instead of just jumping right in. So you see there a picture of an old English manor, and I think that's where one of the origins of this concept, this modern contemporary concept of privacy, comes from. It has something to do with the home and location. So we think of it oftentimes in terms of spatial orientation, like where you live, where you are, things like that, although privacy can mean many other things from a constitutional perspective as well. So this Anglo-Saxon feudalism, this notion of fealty and independence, and again, that term we used several weeks ago, curtilage, having a purview over a certain area. It's interesting, thinking of more interdependent societies, denser populations in cities, and living situations where people are a lot closer to each other. Is privacy a luxury physically, but also in terms of concepts of material, your data? Is that a luxury, or is that a right? These are important things to consider. Also, if we're looking at the origins here, we can take a look at the growth of democratic liberalism. Think of John Locke. Think of the body as property. He had a whole treatise on how labor, the work produced by one's body, is actually something that they own and they can sell and share. And I think there's some connection there between the Lockean idea of the body as a center of currency, of value, that helps us to understand where this modern Western concept of privacy comes from. Also, again, remember Jefferson writing about the pursuit of happiness as an unalienable right. The pursuit of happiness, not the happiness itself, and that maybe privacy is a form of happiness. Also, we see undeniably in the past 200 years the rise of what we call nation states, countries. We had nations before, we had empires before, but there's sort of a particular brand of nation state that's happened in the past 200 years that has these codified civil liberties born out of the Enlightenment. Even very old civilizations like India have been charged with sort of this new way of looking at civil liberties from a Western perspective, largely because it was imposed upon them, and largely because it's basically the global vocabulary for politics nowadays is thinking about the nation state and how what the role of the nation state is in terms of preserving privacy or denying it in some cases. Also, we have this very strong cultural attitude about individualism, that this is my body, this is my money, this is my debt, this is my achievement. Those sorts of things, not all cultures have that. This is very distinct in the West, and maybe there's a link between that sociological concept of individualism, of proprietoriness, that you own yourself, you own your own work. That is definitely sort of a modern worldview. And also, it's important to keep in mind that there's not much of a legal definition of one's selfhood as a sphere of privacy. In other words, a lot of this is sort of a cultural attitude. We don't have a huge amount of constitutional case law that deals with privacy until very recently. Another kind of several things to think about is the idea of the frontier. As America grew in population and moved largely more western, our center of gravity of the population has moved. Now I think if you locate the center of gravity of the America's population, it's somewhere in Nebraska now, including, just sort of as the center of where people live. So America's geographic worldview of an open, unclaimed, individualized sort of region to be populated has also, I think, enhanced that notion of privacy. You can carve out your own land, your own neighborhood, and refashion it the way you like. That's very much about, related to this idea of privacy. It's my territory, my location, and I can do things within that I want. And that's been kind of a Western common law bedrock for the past 200 years. But also, interestingly enough, the next two phrases might be strike you as something maybe you didn't know before, but in the sort of colonial era in New England in particular, there are these residency laws. Even among free people, some mobility was restricted, and public actions were restricted. Same with what are called the sumptuary laws. There are these sumptuary laws. I'll go back. Sumptuary laws restricted the kind of clothing that people would wear, not requiring people to wear clothes, but requiring them to not wear flamboyant clothes. In other words, there was a very strong sort of, then and now, I guess, a sort of a class attitude about what's proper and what's not. Basically, the sumptuary laws restricted poor people from wearing rich people's clothes, which again might strike us as different and something you didn't know. And so one of the things that I'm drawing out of this, that I want to draw out of this, is out of this idea of privacy, personal privacy. It also, the flip side of the coin is what happens in public. So what is the relationship between public and private? What can you do in private that you can't do in public, and vice versa? So mobility. One of the Hirabayashi case that we're going to take a look at deals with mobility. Is that an extension of privacy, or do we have a right of moving around? Do we have a right to wear certain clothes out in public? Those sorts of things. So a lot of those factors have gone into our developing our notion of privacy. Also, interestingly enough, Benjamin Franklin was a very strong advocate of a confidential post office. George Washington, as general of the Continental Army, sometimes would complain that he would get mail through their postal service, rudimentary though it was, and it would be opened. So even the General Washington saw the need for a confidential post office. But what exactly does that mean? In order to be registered, to have your address registered, to have your mail delivered to you, where it cannot be reasonably opened for any particular reason except for in emergencies or concerns about terrorism, things like that. And that's become a very strong. Post office sounds so mundane, but it's really kind of an important stamp of our cultural attitudes about privacy, private communication. Also, the census. We're in a census here, and in late 19th century, this ended in 1890. Some of these questions might be seen as too incisive about your relationship with disease or disability. Some people might have felt, even back then, this was kind of controversial, that was too intrusive. Just the job of the census is just to count heads. It's not to ask, is this a citizen or not? Are you going to vote or not? What's your political party or not? Are you healthy or not? It was simply to count heads. And that's been a little controversial because some people have pushed to change some of the the questions that are on the census as we speak for 2020. But again, some of the questions might seem like they're intrusive in terms of our sense of privacy. And the last slide I wanted to share with you here in this last bit of information on this slide was this idea of penumbra from a completely different perspective in the Griswold versus Connecticut case, which we're going to look at later on, which has to do with women's health. Justice Douglas created this term called the penumbra. He didn't actually create it. It's a term from astronomy, but he appropriated the term penumbra. Some of you might know, if you took an astronomy course, what a penumbra is. It's this, which sounds completely weird, but it actually makes some sense. He made this interesting case that there's nothing in the Constitution that clearly defines privacy. There's no right of privacy there. But just like if you look at the slide, just like a penumbra, you know that it's there even if you can't see it. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's kind of a little confusing with this diagram. I was hoping that it would help make sense. You know it's there, but it's not clearly defined. And that's potentially controversial to make constitutional claims based on things that are not written but implied. However, it's a pretty compelling idea. And it's one that's pretty attractive to a lot of people, to believe that there's at least an implication of privacy. Again, remember, it does not say anything about privacy in the Constitution. So a few other things. Pluralism, sort of this idea of mandated tolerance of difference. Where does our sense of privacy come from? Sometimes it's when that's restricted, right? When that's threatened. The growth of federal government. Again, asking these questions about quality of life and things like that might feel like an invasion of privacy, perhaps. Let's see, technology. Oh, big one, right? So all these technologies, phone, TV, internet, media, IDs, credit card, radar, surveillance, social media, all these things were not even thought of when the Constitution was written. These have changed how we think about privacy and public health. We're in a pandemic right now, and we might face some critical questions about what's our role, what's the role of government in terms of restricting the growth of a pandemic in relation to someone's private health information. So these are really interesting questions. One other thing I wanted to mention about the historical development is the inclusion of what's called the Commons in Great Britain, where we draw a lot of our heritage from in terms of constitutional principles. This idea of the Commons, there was the land that was hunted freely, and then as we got to America, we started to enclose that. We started to build on that and privatize everything. So even in public spheres like a park, you can't freely hunt, right? So what does it mean to be private out in the wild, right? And do you own your own communication? Is the right of privacy the right to be left alone? What is privacy, after all? Yeah, and one last slide here, and then we'll go to the specific cases, is this. Again, if we're looking at the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about privacy, but it does have a very clear principle in terms of our relationship with law enforcement. There shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures, it says. No unreasonable searches and seizures. It doesn't say none, but it has to be based on reason. There cannot be any warrants given without a probable cause. That is a bedrock concept. There shall not be vague criteria used for warrants, right? And this idea of ordered liberty is primary here. And out of that has come a particular case known as Weeks versus U.S. Way back 100 years ago, that excludes evidence that's captured in extra constitutional ways. In other words, if you obtain evidence in a criminal case, or even in a civil case, that contradicts constitutional principles, especially Amendment 4, then it must be thrown out. Now, there are, of course, some tweaks to that, but that's the basic idea. It's not a brand new concept. It's not something from the 1960s, although it was kind of enhanced in the 1960s, as we'll see. Okay, so look at the other video, and we'll pick up where we left off. Thanks.